All right, so Energy Transfer came out with a notice to shippers today on their Bayou Bridge Pipeline, essentially calling for what I would call a flash open season on the pipeline. And the notice has some interesting language, which may help answer some folks' questions, and I think helps solidify some of my thoughts on what's been happening with spread volatility and where we're seeing potential flows on some of the pipelines because of the volatility in prices and spreads. So we can just dive right into this, and I'll switch over to this screen, which shows the notice to shippers. Uh, the first part that jumped out to me was due to the market conditions on the second line here, just talking about the market conditions on the pipeline, and saying has received greatly increased market interest for transportation on Bayou Bridge starting in May 2026. So the date is interesting to me as well, and maybe we'll talk about that when we dive into what Bayou Bridge actually does and what the recent flows have been. I know we've talked about Bayou Bridge on some videos before. It's been a while, so and this notice makes it topical again. So we'll talk about it again. In order to make space for space on the pipeline available to the market, the carrier is conducting an auction process for non-contracted capacity on the pipeline. So I haven't seen a lot of crude oil pipelines do this. This is common on natural gas pipelines to do these kinds of open seasons. It's not that common on oil pipelines, at least not that I'm aware of. Certainly not something that gets sent out to the public very often. Just the terms really quick. Interested shippers must bid for 10,000 barrels per day. Again, this is a May start date. Transportation will be from Nederland to Lake Charles or St. James. We'll go over the geography on that in just a minute. Each bid should be volume, basic terms. Term cannot exceed 7 months, so it looks like they're trying to take advantage of some of the near-term volatility, and the rate must be higher than $2.15 a barrel. So we'll see what happens with this, but and then we'll speculate. Let's dive into Bayou Bridge, and then we'll speculate on what this may mean for the market. So I have the refineries up. We'll talk about these shortly. Maybe I'll just take those off for now. Um, let's pull up Bayou Bridge. So I'm just going to type Bayou Bridge up here in the search and then pull this up here. Again, I know we've talked about this pipeline before. The pipeline's moving oil from Nederland, Energy Transfer's terminal here in Nederland, over into Louisiana, where it's largely feeding refineries. So the three refineries in Lake Charles, two of them get fed by Bayou Bridge, and then there's a smaller amount of volume that goes this way and feeds into kind of the St. James area and refineries this way. So if we want to look at the actual flows on the pipelines, we can click on the chevron there, and we can see the actual throughputs. As you can see, this is a pretty healthily filled pipeline at the Texas-Louisiana border here. And we've talked about this before. Most of these barrels are ending up in Lake Charles. So I'm going to click on this Lake Charles point, and we'll actually see where these are feeding into. The vast majority of the barrels moving across the border are being delivered into Lake Charles. Phillips 66 is getting those, and Citgo is getting those. That's the vast majority of where those barrels are going. There is a third refinery there. It is, as far as I know, getting just barge volumes, and that's probably over from Texas. They aren't getting volumes from Bayou Bridge. And I'll just turn on the refineries here. So the blue dots that you see here are the refineries, and we'll get into some of those. So if we look further down the line, so we talked about what's coming across the border. We talked about what's going into Lake Charles. If we see what's going past Lake Charles, you'll see that, I'm just switch to throughput here. You'll see it's not a lot of oil is making its way, maybe 50,000 barrels a day, maybe on good months, 100,000 barrels per day is making its way over. So again, the vast majority of this pipeline's volumes are just going to Lake Charles and filling the refineries here. A little bit makes it over here, and I'm sure there's refinery customers in this area that are taking that small amount. Now, why the sudden interest in Bayou Bridge? At least that's what the shipper notice seemed to indicate. Well, as many of you know, there's a large spread between Brent and WTI crude. I think I looked earlier today, and I think for May delivery, you're looking at a spread of about $11. So Brent crude costs about $11 more than WTI Cushing costs. I'm quoting a Cushing here. Yeah, likely you're you're dealing with a Houston price down here, or a near Houston price in the Beaumont area. So very simplistic thinking on this one. We'll keep it very easy. If you have the choice to buy an inland barrel of WTI Cushing, or a barrel that's tied more to a Brent price, which would be a lot of the imports that are coming into Louisiana, you're going to want the TI price. It's a cheaper price. So that is probably one of the reasons for the interest, the upside of interest, or the increased interest in shipping barrels on Bayou Bridge. It's very likely that some of these refineries over here in Louisiana, which get some imports, and those imports are likely more tied to a global price than what you would get at WTI Cushing, a cheaper WTI Cushing barrel. So with the spread so wide, with an $11 spread, these refineries are going to try to get more of that WTI crude that's inland and in the U.S. and ship that over, instead of buying a more expensive barrel out in the global market and having that imported in. Now, if we look at the actual import data, so I'm looking at non-Canadian imports, or imports that are not from Canada, because Canadian imports are going to come down this way and crossover. There's at least 150,000 barrels per day, and I'm using average 2025 numbers. 150,000 barrels a day of waterborne imports coming into Louisiana. It's possible that there's more. The data that I'm looking at is the EIA data, and sometimes they are not descript with what actual refinery state that the barrels go to. So by my estimation, it's at least 150,000 barrels a day coming into these refineries that are waterborne imports. So if we're looking at Bayou Bridge and thinking about, hey, Bayou Bridge is going to be potentially pumping more crude across for these refineries, what refineries are going to be getting that crude, and what refineries and I guess what refineries is Bayou Bridge potentially going to be delivering into to displace those imports that had been coming in. So if you look at the import data, there's one big refinery that stands out, and that's going to be Valero St. Charles refinery. So something I maybe haven't brought up on videos before, but Plainview has the data for most of the U.S. refineries, the majority of the U.S. refineries, to where you can actually click on the refinery and see what the throughput is. Depending on the area or the state, we have more granular data or less granular data. So if I click on that refinery and I look at the throughputs through that, you can kind of see who the throughputs are coming from. So a Shell pipeline feeds about maybe a little bit over half of the volumes going into that refinery, but the other piece are going to be imports. So as you can see here, so about close to 80,000 barrels a day of imports, this purple section are going to be all imports, are going into Valero's St. Charles refinery. That's by far the most of any of the refineries in Louisiana based on the data set that I'm looking at. So as you can see, Bayou Bridge gets close to serving that refinery. Luckily, well, not luckily, but just the fact of the matter is there is a pipeline also owned by Energy Transfer that goes over and feeds this area. So generally this is feeding other refineries in this area. Maripau's, I believe it feeds the Shell refinery mostly. Let's see if that's correct here. Yeah, Maripau's feeding the Shell refinery there. But it also, just based on the proximity, I would guess it can feed St. Charles as well. So St. Charles, given the choice of paying for a really expensive import barrel or bringing a barrel over from Nederland, may choose to do Nederland. Now, crude grades are important on this to think about. Most of the imports that are coming into Louisiana are medium and heavy. That might make a difference on this, but it does seem that there is some interest in moving some more barrels from the Beaumont area, these landlocked WTI barrels, not landlocked, but linked to a lower price of these WTI barrels, to move those over for these refineries to buy. Phillips 66 Lake Charles takes a little bit of imports, and there's a few other refineries that take smaller amounts of imports coming in. I think Chalmette takes some too, down here, the PBF refinery. So there is some displacement or some barrels that could be replaced, some imports that could be replaced by Bayou Bridge barrels coming across there. So the last thing I want to talk about would be the date. So May is interesting to me, and I'm speculating here, but we may be in a situation where, because of these refineries are locking in the buys of their crude, and the imports that are coming in are on the ship already. They've probably been bought over a month ago, so they probably aren't significantly impacted by the crazy price volatility that we've seen over the last month. But as we get further and further out, and this conflict continues to drag on, and the volatility stays there, if once we get to May, it looks like potentially that refineries are going to have to make a choice between buying a more expensive import barrel, or finding a way to get more barrels, more WTI-linked barrels over to their refinery, a cheaper barrel over to their refinery. So I thought that was interesting to go over. I will keep my eye on all of this stuff. There's certainly some upside to some of the midstream companies, but it's questionable how long that upside will last. So we'll keep an eye on that. But volatility is the name of the game right now. So we'll keep our ear to the ground and see what happens. I hope everybody has a great week. Thanks for watching. Please reach out for any questions. Please reach out if you want a trial. We give free trials of this. You can have all this data at your fingertips. I think we're pretty affordable. So reach out if you're interested. I'm happy to give trials out. All right. Have a great week.